Welcome to this month's Let My People Go webinar. My name is Raleigh. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Let My People Go, and I'm actually joined by my friend Irina. Irina, could you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Raleigh, for having me. So my name is Irina, and I am domestic survivor of sex trafficking, and currently I'm an advocate for the issue.
And so Irina and I have known each other for several years, and one thing we've noticed is that as we're working with people of faith or just people in the community, we've noticed that sometimes people mean well, but they end up doing things that can be harmful. That could be someone who's tweeting out pictures that really portray human trafficking from more of a sensationalistic perspective, or that could be the person who is preaching, and rather than capturing the humanity of those who've suffered exploitation, they speak in a way that makes these people feel commodified or objectified. They may not even know that they're doing it, but for us, we want to really help people think through this, help them really resensitize this topic, because this isn't just a political issue, this isn't just a religious issue, this just isn't a social issue, this is a human issue impacting all of us. We're either part of the solution or we're part of the problem. And so for us, we really need to think through, what does it mean to talk about human trafficking in a way that helps and not hurts? And so with that said, Irina, I feel like some of us, when we talk about human trafficking as individuals, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, we can really send a mixed message. Could you explain how we could communicate better through social media about human trafficking?
That's a great question, Raleigh. And I've seen a lot of posts, by people who mean well, kind of talking about using language that's kind of inundated, like the rescue, or putting up pictures with chains and hands with chains, and that kind of stuff kind of irritates survivor community, myself including, because it's not an accurate portrayal of what actually happens in most of our cases, and you can't just put a blanket picture or make a blanket statement in most cases, because you would kind of do a disservice to all the individual stories that make the entire whole. So I think it's very, very important to be considerate. Now, if you're making a posting, you're probably posting about something specific. If you're talking, let's say you're advertising an event and you're making a flyer, talk to the survivor or a couple of survivor advisors about the flyer. Run it past them saying, hey, do you think this picture is appropriate? Do you think this language is appropriate? Just to give respect and to make sure that when you post this, it doesn't irritate someone, or someone be like, oh, here we go again, another rescue and chain breaking business. That's very important. As a survivor, I realized that it's one of the most important things for me, like feeling respected and feeling that my story is appreciated and is treated as a unique thing that it is, because every story is unique.
So oftentimes I'll go on Twitter and I will see people retweeting these articles that may have an image where there is maybe a young Caucasian girl and her hands are tied, or a young woman chained to a bed or a radiator, or someone whose mouth is duct tape and their hands say, help me.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us don't really think that this can cause issues with people who are actually either experiencing traumatization or have been traumatized. So why are these things bad? Why are these images and talking about human trafficking in a sensational way bad?
Because it's not a good thing to do that, because you kind of, again, you make an individual into an object. And as a matter of fact, an entire group of people, you're objectifying them. You're objectifying their worth, making like, putting pictures with chains, or someone chained to the radiator. And it also creates misconception in people's mind. Oh, this is how human trafficking looks like, when in reality, it's so diverse.
Yeah, and the chains are not always physical, right?
No, it's psychological, emotional, and those are the chains that are hardest to break.
And so all the while, we're looking for this particular thing.
Yeah.
The person chained to the radiator. We're missing the person in our church or in our community or in the grocery store with us or at the gas station who is being exploited by a family member or a boyfriend or a so-called boyfriend.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also creates this kind of image of like captivity, physical captivity, which may not necessarily be the case. The person, like in my case, I was able to go to school. I was still living at home with my mom while this whole thing was taking place. So it's kind of posting those pictures and posting articles that kind of use the archaic language.
And what would archaic language be?
The chains, the rescue, for me, I personally do not like the whole issue with the rescue. So-and-so has been rescued, when in reality, unless the police broke through the door, it's an iffy kind of statement to make.
Because the problem is not just that someone is being held against their will, it's that there has been trauma.
Trauma, yes. The trauma bonding that the captor and the person who's being the abuser and the person who's being abused, there's usually that trauma bonding going on. And that strong attachment of the person who's being abused to the person who's doing the abuse. It's usually someone who the person who's being abused professes to love or care deeply about. And the chains and the radiators, they don't tell the story.
Right.
And then you kind of, when you encounter those cases, like real life cases where the victim is so hurt and so confused, like I once was, you're kind of, you're like, wait a minute, is this human trafficking? What is going on here?
And we think someone's greatest need is to be really taken from point A to point B. And now they're fine. We can wash our hands of it. We did a good deed. But really recovering from trauma, it's a lifelong journey.
Yes.
And so that's really why Let My People Go focuses on fighting human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable, because we really believe that if you care for someone who is vulnerable, whatever that vulnerability could be, they could be currently homeless, they could be a youth who is at risk, they could be someone in a family that's been affected by incarceration, or a single parent household, or an immigrant family, or someone who's just looking for love and affirmation and validation. They could be low-hanging fruit to someone who'd want to exploit them. And so we believe if we target our vulnerable neighbor in our community, then in that way we're caring for people who could be or have been trafficked. We're doing prevention, intervention, and aftercare all in one fell swoop, right? And so I think this conversation is really important that we're having, because sometimes, whether we do this as individuals or corporately, we can trigger or re-traumatize or re-exploit people without even knowing it. And could you explain to me, what is re-exploitation and re-traumatization, and why should we care about that?
Well, basically, re-exploiting someone, it doesn't mean that you have to do what their trafficker did to them and sell them again. You can re-exploit someone by taking their story and using it for your personal gain, whichever it is. On paper, it may look like a good thing, but like the Lord said, He knows your heart, He knows your intentions. So I think it's very important to kind of check your heart, the state of your heart. Why are you doing what you're doing? Do you see this person, whoever went through this horrific experience, as an individual, as God's child? If you don't, then walk away from it. Because the worst thing that you can do, that add insult to injury. And re-traumatization happens, and I've shared my stories many times, and I've had a great number of incredible experiences. But I also, in the very early stages of my advocacy, I ran into a lot of situations where, I haven't developed my voice yet, so wasn't able to, articulate what I wanted. how I wanted to tell my story. So people would be like, well, can you focus on this detail? And it's okay to say to people, well, can you wait while you're sharing, can you kind of, focus on a particular chapter? But it's not okay to ask people for details of their story. You see, we do not need the details to get the whole picture. And because if we're focusing on details, that's voyeurism, and that's wrong. You see, your job as the pastor or leader of a ministry is not for the victim, it's for the survivor. And don't use the word victim, please, for the love of God, don't do that. For the survivor to come out and feel loved and feel appreciated, and whatever they want to share, it's up to them. And even if you know, Raleigh has heard my story many times. And there are times when I felt more comfortable and I share certain details that he has heard that maybe most of my friends have not heard. But he has never came out and said, well, Irina, while sharing, can you focus on this detail? It's never been an issue. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that we respect the story. And the survivor is just to kind of, survivor stories are meant to kind of provide that I factor, that this actually is happening. The whole scope of education is up to you then.
It's funny. I was recently writing a manuscript for my first book to come out. And as I was writing, I shared some things that were really difficult to share. And some of these things I'd shared with a few people, but it was time that I make some of these things public. And it's just part of my story, part of my my vulnerability. And it was so difficult to talk about this. I talked about something at a conference I was at, and I remember leaving feeling shaken, scared, nervous, because I put myself out there. There's this idea of a vulnerability hangover. When you say something, you're like, did I really say that? Am I an idiot? Like, what was I thinking? What? I don't even know them. Like, what in the world? And it's funny because, like, oftentimes when whether we're watching a webinar or whether we're at a church with a survivor who is speaking, we don't think about the shame that that person experienced, and we don't think about the courage that that person has in order to say what they're saying in front of so many people. And it's so interesting to me that I think the best corrective, the best way to see this in a way that like is non-exploitative is to say, how would you feel if you were sharing your deepest, darkest, innermost secret, that thing that you feel the most shame about in your life, with new people all the time? How would you feel if someone came up to you and said, hey, I love your shame story. It's great. It'd be a good movie. This is phenomenal. I would love for you to focus on this piece.
It does a lot of disservice, and it kind of discredits the human thing. You know, every survivor story is unique, and you can measure someone's pain. So if someone went through this experience and someone else went through something different yet similar, you know, main thing, like Raleigh said, it's called the vulnerability, and somebody's humanity was taken away from them. And it's important that as a body of Christ that we focus on protecting and maintaining that humanity of that person. They are not an object. They are not a fixture of your church. Their testimony belongs to them. It's God-given to them. So you can ask people to share, but sometimes survivors may not be ready to share. It took me a couple of years to be able to come out and share what happened. And I needed that support and just to be loved upon.
You mentioned something that I think may have taken a few of our viewers off guard. You said, don't use the term victim.
Yes.
Why?
Because a victim is someone who's actively being exploited. It's something that's actively happening. And if you walked away from that experience, if let's say you've been rescued by police from that experience, you know, you're no longer a victim. You're transitioning into that survivor stage. And I believe there are 3 stages. The first of all, it's a victim stage when something is happening to you. Then there is a survivor stage when you kind of came out of it and you have all this pain and all these emotions, you know, kind of going on inside of you. And then the third stage is the overcomer stage, where you say, you know what, God made me bigger than my pain, and He's healing me. So it's kind of understanding that just because you've been victimized doesn't make you a victim.
You know, it's interesting. We have to think about talking about issues of vulnerability with language that empowers. I was recently talking with a friend of mine who is actually one of my board members, and we were talking about how to address issues of vulnerability from the pulpit. And I said, if you can't preach your message at a homeless shelter, if you would have to change it around, then it's not empowering. I feel that we need to speak to people not as these little puppies that need to be rescued, but as people who have the same dignity that we have, who may have had a couple things not break their way that broke ours. And we need to speak to them and say, we want to walk with you. God has built His answer into your life. He wants to raise you up, and maybe He wants to use you to change your community. We look at the scriptures, and over and over and over, God wasn't saying, hey, you people with money and you who has it all together. He was saying, hey, fisherman, hey, tax collector who's considered a traitor. He's getting the bottom of the barrel, or the barrel. The bottom of the barrel. And as He teaches in parables, He's even using this idea of the worst possible candidates are the people who are closest to Jesus.
Yes.
And so God has always used broken people to make the world whole, because He makes the world whole through them. And so for us, we have to think about when we talk on homelessness or immigration, we need to talk about it not just as an issue, but as something that is impacting people who look just like us, who talk just like us, who have experienced things that we have experienced, regardless of their culture, regardless of their language for that matter, but people who have the same dignity that we have. And so for us, as we're kind of talking about churches at this point, what are some examples that you have heard about how churches have talked about exploitation or human trafficking? What are some examples that were really bad? Some things that should be avoided?
Using the P word, that's prostitute.
Why is that bad? Why is prostitute?
That's a label.
Okay.
And that's like, basically, I would rather be slapped than be called that. And it's an
identifier, isn't it? It's like, you are this.
Yes, and it's something that is kind of, word prostitute. First of all, at the core of its meaning, it has choice built into it. This is like a career. This is something that she chose to do, versus this is something that happened to her or him, for that matter.
Right.
You know, so it's not. I really discourage pastors using the word prostitute. Really do discourage that, because it really, even if you have survivors or people who are going through that issue, sitting in your pews, hearing that word is just like being slapped in the face. And it's really, I understand that people don't know, but it's better to say a person in prostitution or somebody who has been exploited. That's even better, because that language matters. You know, you can't just say, well, it doesn't matter. I heard some pastors say, well, word prostitute is in the Bible. And I'm like, oh, okay, but you know, you can kind of work around that. Not changing the scripture, but you're saying the word person in prostitution might be more respectful. And I'm like, what would Jesus do? You know, would He disrespect that person and say, well, she's a prostitute? And
words matter. And some people could say, well, people are just being sensitive. But here's the thing. There are people in your church right now, when you're preaching, whoever, like if there are any pastors or any leaders out there who teach people, or I mean, anyone who has a social media following, here's the deal, guys. Like, when we talk about these things, we are conveying in a sense, what we believe. So someone could hear this and be like, wow, that person's never going to care for me because I was trapped in prostitution. And maybe I'm a bad person. Maybe I'm not good. Like, the Bible uses a lot of terms, but for us, we want to say, even as we're preaching, we want to communicate that people are loved, that they are cared for, and that ultimately the whole point of Scripture is that though mankind is broken and cannot save itself, Christ has become human to save us from ourselves so that we would love others. There is something beautiful about this idea. And what I want to see is those of us who are preaching this unbelievably life-changing message, I want to see us preach it in a way that connects with people who've experienced all sorts of trauma. I heard a study recently that 1 in 6 women had experienced sexual abuse at some point, or will experience it at some point in their lives. And the number for men is not too far off. This can happen. This is happening in your community. The way we talk about these things will either empower or disempower.
Absolutely. And you want to be able, for the people who have gone through some sort of exploitation, to be able to come to you and feel comfortable talking to you. You know, because if you're using language that alienates them from you, they're not going to seek help. They really will not. And they will not look to you as that leader who will walk alongside of them through their journey of healing, because they were like, well, this person can't even address me in a proper manner. How can they help me? So for me, that's a huge thing.
Right. And so how can we, Irina, how can we do this? How can we talk about something like this without re-traumatizing people in our congregations?
Ooh, that's like a topic in its own right. But I think for starters, it's important for pastors to be educated about the issue. And I think the secular world, I'm sorry to say, is far ahead of us in a lot of ways. They don't use language that's stigmatizing for the most part. They try to kind of use language that will respect the human identity of the person who went through the exploitation. Being trauma informed, there are a lot of organizations do trainings, going online and even Googling them will be a good start to kind of see what's available, because you cannot talk about something that you know nothing about. That's when the whole word prostitute comes in, and the word victim, and the pictures with chains and radiators, because we don't really, not understanding the depth and the complexity of the issues will land us in hot water. We, as a church, Jesus did social justice every day of his life. So those people who say that, well, we just there to preach and teach, they should lock down their church, because Jesus did social justice every day. So we have to know how to address the people who are hurting in a way that he did. Jesus stooped down and he reached out to people. So why can people who stand behind the pulpit cannot do the same thing?
Absolutely. And really, the way that we speak about issues of human trafficking, it reveals how involved we really are. Because if we just are bulls in like china cabinets and we just don't care about our words, then it is evidence that we're probably not friends with people that have suffered that.
Absolutely.
I remember one of my friends was exploited in a particular way, and I won't go into detail, but it was very traumatic for her. Now she shared this with me, and I'll never forget, after that, watching a movie, and they were just talking about this traumatic detail like it was nothing, and I had to walk out of the theater because I was overwhelmed. I was overcome by emotion because I had connected with my friend in their point of pain. And I think if we're really engaging the vulnerable community around us, which any of us can be vulnerable at any time, none of us are immune. But if we're really tracking with other people who are suffering, then we're mourning with them.
Yes.
So if something hurts them, or if something is said in a way that hurts them, we should care about it. And not just say, oh, well, you know, they're just being sensitive. Well, maybe.
Yes.
Maybe they're being sensitive. Maybe they have a good reason to be sensitive.
Yes. And with trauma, what a lot of church leaders don't realize is that with trauma, just because a moment had passed, you know, that the memory of it remains very fresh. It's like you get frozen in time for that, in that particular moment. It's like you're still 12 years old or 13 or even 29 years old. You still, you know, you moved on. Your life has moved on, but there's still part of you that's remained back there. You know, and what trigger means is that basically you're kind of hitting that hot spot with careless words or actions, you know, or telling people that how far along they should be in their healing journey instead of walking alongside of them. I'm sorry, I had to bring that one up because
it's so good.
It's a hot topic as well. Well, it's been 4 years now, so how come you haven't? Your healing is not progressing forward. You're supposed to be healed by now. How?
Well, that's when you look at them and you're like, first of all, stop telling stories, because we know that you still struggle with that sin that you've been struggling with for the last 10 years. And you're like, well, Lord, just give me grace. That's great. How about you give some of that grace to that other person? How about you look at them graciously? Because we're all on this life journey. We're on this healing journey. We're all a big mess. We get offended by things. And we're like, why did I get offended by that?
Absolutely.
Or we say things and we're like, why did I say that? But at the end of the day, I think it's just really important that, I love what you said, for us, in the way that we communicate, in the way that we serve, we are not the solution to people's problems.
Yes, absolutely.
We would say that Jesus is the solution, but we as equally flawed human beings can walk alongside of each other on our healing journeys. Because my friend who's experienced A may have a completely different experience than me, but with what I've experienced, I can say, you know what, I've been hurt too, I've struggled too, and I can't imagine what you were going through, but I'm here for you. And if you need to talk, if you need to unwind, if you just need to vent, I'm here, I'm praying for you, and I just want to walk with you. But we want to do this in a way that empowers people, not in the idea of, well, we just need to save them all. And we're forgetting who the hero is. The hero is that person in your church who has been abused by a family member, who has experienced intimate partner violence, who has been trafficked for sex, labor, or domestic servitude. That's the person that's a hero, because God always uses the underdog.
Absolutely.
And so, Irina, thank you for this. I feel like you've given us so much to think about, and I'm excited to hear back from those who watch this, just to see how this may change their approach.
I think I wanted to ask you, Raleigh, because I mentioned Google as a resource, but I'm kind of like, I know it's a tricky business, so I wanted to maybe perhaps for Pastor Raleigh to mention some of the resources where a church, well-meaning pastor or minister can go online and say like, well, I want to start educating myself. What would be the good point for them to start?
Well, a great place to start as far as general education about human trafficking would be the polarisproject.org. Polaris is basically your one-stop shop for all things human trafficking, abolition. They will help you think through things. They also power the human trafficking national hotline. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is 1-888-373-7888, or you can text Be Free. And in communicating with them, you can learn more. They can refer you to articles, but you can also report what you're seeing there. Another great, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, the Let My People Go website has several stories, including yours, where you're sharing your journey. And these are stories that churches can use. These are videos that churches can use that are non-exploitative. And for us to do that, we not only ask permission to film this, but when we do it, I basically, like, when it came time for Irina's, I was like, I would love for you to share your story. Share whatever you want. It's
Yes.
your story.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're really getting something that's from the heart of the person sharing. And these have been vetted. These have been thought through. And so this is something that you can use. I also want to remind you that we will send this video to you via email if you have signed up online to watch this. And also, we're creating a pamphlet for churches and those who care about the language that they use to really help them think through talking about exploitation without exploiting others. And I mean, I've talked to some incredible friends who are not only advocates but survivors, and who have really helped Let My People Go think through how to talk about this in a way that is empowering. And so we will be making that available soon. And we just hope that you really read it with an open heart and think through it. And so again, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And every first Tuesday of every month at 6:30 p.m., we gather together to have a conversation. So join us next month.
Have a good one.